we're going to continue with our discussion of last time, and we're slowly working up to the point where I can explain to you the ontology of human civilization. I was hoping to get to it today, but we got stuck on causation. And causation, well, it's a mess. And most of what you're taught in philosophy courses about it is false. And I'm trying to correct some of those falsehoods. There are several propositions which constitute the current orthodoxy about causation. Most of these propositions are due to Hume. I gave you 3 of them last time, but I'll give you a 4th this time. The 4th is that causation is always a relation between events, between discrete events. So the philosopher's favorite example is always the billiard ball making its inexorable way across the green table, and it bangs into the other billiard ball, and then a miracle happens. The first billiard ball stops and the second billiard ball moves. That is the philosopher's favorite example. And it's a fine example. It's just there are a lot of cases that aren't like that. Okay, I pointed out last time there are lots of cases where causation is not a relation between discrete events, but there are permanent states in the universe that act causally. Gravity is my favorite because I think I understand it a little bit. By the way, nobody understands why there is gravity. It's one of those mini scandals in science that nobody tells you about when you take a science course. We don't know why there's gravitational attraction, but anyway, it is. It's pretty damn pervasive, as I can demonstrate by dropping pieces of chalk. Okay, so it's just not true that every cause is a relation between events, but that leads to the next decisive point, and that is that there's no connection between the cause and the effect. That, as Hume said, there's no necessary connection. And we would put that today by saying that each event is a discrete event. First this happens and then that happens. There's no connection between the two. And Hume's grounds for asserting that were empiricist grounds, and that is you can't observe a causal relation. All you can observe when you observe cause and effect is first the thing you call a cause is followed by the thing you call the effect. But that's it. Literally speaking, causation is just one damn thing after another. Of course, damn is a metaphor there. It is one thing after another. But anyway, nowadays people use the word literally to mean something other than literally. So they say things like, when Sally told me she was pregnant, I was literally blown away. Well, really? I mean, metaphorically, literally, you were blown away. Or the other guy who says, God, was it raining? It was literally raining cats and dogs. I try to imagine what that would be like. But in any case, you cannot observe the causal relation. Causation is just one thing after another. But that leads to the next thing. Well, then what makes causal statements true? If there's just the cause and the effect, how can it be true? See, the idea that Hume had, and it's a very powerful idea, is there couldn't be a case in the universe where a single event caused another event, and that was it. There never was a repetition of that pattern again. You couldn't have causation as a single one-time off relation between events, and that's because what makes it true that A cause B is that they instantiate a regularity. Whenever events of the A type occur, events of the B type occur, and that is what makes it true that there is a causal relation. And since we've been using Hume's jargon, Hume says what makes it true is that there is a constant conjunction of resembling instances. And you remember Hume was beating about the bush looking for necessary connection. He didn't find it, but he found something else. Hume to the rescue, typical of Hume. He gives you a skeptical conclusion, and then he tells you all the same it's okay to believe the nonsense you believe. You can't help it, and that's because of the habit you get from constant conjunction. And finally, there's something that Hume didn't say, but his followers have said. causal relations are quite different from logical relations. That whenever you have a causal relation, it must be the case that the cause is completely independent of the effect, because, of course, the idea of the constant conjunction is it just states absolutely contingent regularities. Okay, now I'm going to attack all of these. These three seem to me false. This one is true if you understand it in a certain way, but you have to modify it quite a bit to get a truth out of it. Why are we doing all this? The reason is because the explanation of human behavior is a causal form of explanation, but it requires a special kind of causation, which is intentional causation. And when we get to the form of explanation of human behavior, we'll see that the mechanism for explaining human behavior requires a special kind of causation, whereby the cause is a mental representation. I'm using naive vocabulary here, a mental representation of the effect. Or as we would now say, causes are typically intentional states where the effect is the condition of satisfaction or part of the condition of satisfaction of the intentional state. Why did so many people vote for Obama? They were fed up with Bush. They didn't like the situation in the economy. They thought that Obama would produce a better foreign policy and a better domestic policy. All of those are mental states, and they function causally to produce an effect, the effect of voting for Obama. And each of these, the causes in the form of the reasons produce an effect in the form of a decision where there is a logical relation between the reasons and the decision. And as you know, the decision is a prior intention, and then that leads to an intention in action. So the explanation of human behavior requires reference to a type of causation that's not allowed for by this picture. The type of causation says there is a logical relation, and indeed, in many cases, a necessary connection between the cause and the effect, and you experience the causal relation whenever you act on a reason. You experience yourself as acting on that reason. The picture, let me state a historical irony. The most primitive notion of causation, the one the child acquires very early on, is intentional causation. Things happen because you want them to happen, or other people want them to happen. And events happening are intelligible to us because we see them as the expression of purposes. And as the primitive people become more ambitious, they say things like, the weather's so awful because the gods are angry at us. This horrible rainstorm is a speech act by God by which the gods are expressing their anger or their fury at us. It takes an enormous amount of sophistication to see that there are causes that are not intentionalistic, that there is no intentionality. In the Middle Ages, it was common in the medieval conception of physics to think in terms of teleology. The reason the body continues in this form, in the way that it does, is that it's trying to achieve a goal. It's trying to achieve the goal of a certain type of flight, a certain type of movement. The reason objects fall toward the earth is they're trying to achieve the goal of getting closer to the center of the earth. It took an enormous intellectual leap, and it wasn't until the 17th century that this intellectual leap became generally accepted as part of intellectual culture, that the standard form of causation involves no intentionality at all. It's just a brute relation between events where there's no mental component, and we're to see nature as completely indifferent. We're to see nature as having no goals or purposes, and what we discover when we discover the laws of nature are simple regularities. Okay, and then the temptation then is to go back and rewrite what we thought of as intentional causation as just event causation. This is sometimes called the regularity theory of causation. All there is to causation are regularities. Okay, let's start criticizing it. Step one, I've already said, there are cases of causal relations that are not between events, that are permanent features of the world, permanent forces operating. A second, to the second point, that you can't observe the causal relation, it seems to me we directly experience it all the time. Watch. I try to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. Now, you mean to tell me I didn't experience myself making it go up? Now, you're all philosophers, and you'll say, yes, but it could have been a hallucination. Anything can be a hallucination. That's not the point. The point is that we have the experience of something seeming to cause something else. Of course, it's a seeming cause. In a way, this is a seeming piece of chalk, and this is a seeming jacket, and this is a seeming table. As empiricists, we always allow for the possibility of error. But there isn't any question that we experience causation whenever we intentionally make something happen. Any particular instance might be a hallucination, but there's no question that the experience is one of something making something happen. Now, furthermore, we also experience in perception. I'm walking along the street, and some guy bangs into me and knocks me into the gutter. You mean I didn't experience myself being pushed off the sidewalk? Push is a causal notion. The pushing is what causes me to go off of the sidewalk. Elizabeth Anscombe had a beautiful example of this. Elizabeth is sitting at her desk, and outside there's a car that backfires, makes a loud noise, and she jumps. Now, did she not experience the noise making her jump? She did experience it. Is it because she drew an inference from all the thousands of times that this had happened before? The very first time it happens, she will observe, she will experience that the cause of her jumping was the loud noise. You don't just experience a noise and you're jumping, two discrete events. You observe watch this vocabulary, the noise making you jump. What's the definition of causation which we're using here? It's very primitive and very commonsensical. The cause of something is what makes it happen. It's what accounts for it, what explains it. And that's what we have in all of these cases. So you observe, or rather I would say you experience the necessary connection whenever you intentionally act, whenever you intentionally produce a bodily movement, you experience the intention in action causing the bodily movement. Or in perception, whenever you have a perceptual experience, you experience the thing that you are perceiving causing a conscious experience in you. Now, I think, in a way, Hume was looking at the wrong place. Hume wanted to say, well, let's go and observe any two events, A and B, and you can't see a connection between those two events. Well, but suppose one of these is your own experience, and you experience your intention causing the bodily movement, or you observe, in the case of perception, the object causing in you an experience. Now, I would prefer to say not that that's an observation. That suggests you're standing outside looking, but it is a direct experience. You experience yourself making something happen. That's actioning, and that's action. And you experience something making something happen in you. That's perception. So, contrary to Hume, who says we never experience causation, I want to say, roughly speaking, we experience it all day long. You cannot make it through the day without a constant experience of yourself making things happen in the form of action, and things making things happen to you in the form of perception. So causation is more or less everywhere, and it's experienced more or less continually. And indeed, it's hard to see how the organism would survive, how evolution how we could have coped with an environment unless we learned to cope by making things happen and becoming aware of how things make things happen to us. Okay, so it seems to me we get this pretty much all the time. How about the regularities? This is another item of intellectual history that I am not fully confident about. And those of you who are better historians than I am, I wish you would check it out for me. When did people ever get the idea that nature was entirely a matter of laws, of causal laws? I think it was in the 17th century. Now, I don't know Greek well enough to have an intelligent opinion, but my impression is Aristotle and Plato have none to say about causal laws, about laws of nature. And I'm speculating here because I was forbidden to read Aristotle when I was an undergraduate in Oxford. I was told, you don't know Greek, don't read Aristotle, you won't understand a word. Never tell undergraduates not to do the work. They're already too tempted not to do the work. So I don't know. I know enough Aristotle to have an intelligent opinion, but my impression is that in Aristotle's discussion of physics and metaphysics, there's not a long account of causal laws. And when he talks about the laws, he means laws in the political sense, laws of human societies. So I think it's a fairly late notion. I think it's probably came in the 17th century, but now it has become widely accepted, certainly by philosophers, that every causal relation must be backed by a law. And I want to say that's got to be wrong. Even for a complete determinist, that has to be wrong, because the size of events picked out by the laws does not match the size of the events picked out by causal explanations. As I said, between the wars, there was an endless discussion of the causes of the First World War. Now notice, we think it must have an explanation. Nobody would get a PhD by saying, well, I was going to write a thesis on the causes of the First World War, but I'll tell you, it's just one of those damn things that happened. Didn't have any causes. So that's my thesis. I'm going to explain to you why there were no causes of the First World War. Now, you can't get away with that. Even in postmodern history departments, I doubt if you could get away with that, because Kant was right. We do perceive things in causal categories. We assume that events in nature have a causal explanation. But the idea that the causal explanation must be backed by laws, I think, does not fit with what we know about the nature of laws and the nature of explanation. Specifically, if you imagine the sorts of causes that you would give for events. I mean, after the election, a lot of Republicans wondered what was the cause of our defeat in the 2008 presidential elections. And a lot of Democrats were anxious to understand fully the causes of their victory. And you can list various causes. Dissatisfaction with the state of the economy was probably a leading cause. Another cause was a concern about the slow progress of the so-called war against terror. A third factor, I think, was just boredom with Bush. Bush was a nice enough guy, but you got sick of hearing his damn voice all the time. Or at least I did. Now, maybe I was special in this regard. But I think those are the kind of things that you would list if you were giving an account of the causes of the Republican defeat and the Democratic victory. Now, it's true, Bush wasn't running, but there was no way that McCain could dissociate himself completely from his Republican forebears. All right, so that's the sort of thing you would give. Now, what would the law look like? Suppose that, in fact, a really superior and epistemically perfect account would show that it was dissatisfaction with the economy that was the primary cause of the Republican defeat in the presidential election. What would the law look like that said massive dissatisfaction of the economy? There couldn't be such a law. Laws are things like force equals mass times acceleration, and the size of events they pick out are not things like massive dissatisfaction with the economy. So it isn't that, well, we just don't know the laws. We got to do much more research until we know the laws. I think we have a misconception of the nature of the laws and the relation of laws to explanation. There can be a perfectly valid causal explanation of a social phenomenon, the causes of the Great Depression or the migration to California after the Second World War, without the whole thing being backed by laws. Now, when we get into the philosophy of the social sciences, you'll see that a lot of people thought, well, really there are laws, it's just they're kind of complicated and hard to state. See, the greatest mass migration in human history was the movement of Americans to California after the Second World War. Now, that's very interesting to us because there's no question that it happened, but also it was not collective intentionality. people didn't think we're all moving to California together. It wasn't like the Mormons. You see, the Mormons going to Utah was collective intentionality, and they were led by a political genius, Brigham Young. Fortunately, Brigham Young had a rather small field in which to operate a bunch of Mormons, and he never really had national or international power, but he was a political genius, and he got all these people to move there. That was collective intentionality. But the movement, the mass migration of Californians, was not collective intentionality. It just happened that a whole lot of individuals decided, we don't have to spend another winter in Duluth, Minnesota. We can all move to Los Angeles, and they all did move, or so it seems sometimes, to Los Angeles. But in any case, that was a case of mass migration, and there are standard historical causal accounts of that. None of those are backed by laws, and I'm not sure what the laws would look like. Now, we're going to say more about this when we talk about the covering law model of explanation in the social sciences, because, as I've mentioned before, Peter Hempel says, no, there really are laws. It's just that they're kind of hard to state. He gives the example of the Okies' migration to California after the Dust Bowl, and he tries to state a law that he thought might cover the movement of the dispossessed Dust Bowl farmers in Oklahoma to California. I'll come back to that later, but what I'm suggesting now is there are causes without that we have the experience of causation, whereas the meaning of causation is what made it happen. We have the experience of something making something else happen, and it needn't be backed by regularities. Of course, we assume nature is uniform, but that's not a specialty of causation. I mean, the notion of a table or a rostrum or a chair or a piece of chalk, all of those involve the notion of regularities. If the piece of chalk suddenly transformed itself into a bird and flew away, or if it transformed itself into a Chevrolet station wagon and ran over most of us, well, we'd be in a hell of a fix. I mean, we wouldn't know what to say, but we take it for granted that nature is uniform. But that's not a special feature of causation. We assume that there will be a certain regularity in the behavior of the universe, and it isn't that is a special a feature of causal explanations, that they're backed by statements of universal regularities. Now, I would like to understand the whole notion of a scientific law much better than I do. I'm sure that the metaphor of law is the wrong metaphor because, of course, people will say things like, we now know that nature is governed by the laws of physics. Now, wait a second. Governed? It's not a case of government. What the most they could mean is describable by the laws of physics. If there's a metaphor of government, it would have to be physical forces dominating us. But we know that there are only 4 of those: electromagnetism, gravity, and the weak and strong nuclear forces. But well, okay, I'm going to come back to that when we talk about explanation of social science. The point I'm making now is this is true for some cases, but not all. This is false, and this one is true for a lot of cases. I mean, if I drop the piece of chalk, I can find a covering law that will cover its behavior. But there are lots of cases where there is no covering law, and we have no idea what it would be like to find one. Now, this one, that the contrast between the causal relation and the logical relation is, I think, a kind of category mistake. And Davidson pointed this out, that whether or not 2 events are logically related depends on how you describe them. So if I say the cause of A caused A, well, there's a logical relation there. The cause of A caused A is trivial, but it doesn't mean that you're not specifying, that you're not mentioning a causal relation. The point, however, which is the reason that this is interesting for us, is precisely in the case of intentional causation, there is a logical relation. It's not one of entailment, but it's one of conditions of satisfaction. In the case of intentional causation, the effect is a condition of satisfaction of the cause. That's when I'm trying to raise my arm. Or in the case of perception, a cause is a condition of satisfaction of the effect. The cause in the form of the object I see is the condition of satisfaction of my perceptual experience of it. So there is, and this is very peculiar about human behavior, and again, when we talk about the social sciences, I'll go into this in more detail, but right now we can say it is a peculiarity of the explanation of human behavior using intentional causation that the concept used in the explanation must itself function causally in producing the event to be explained. And that has no analog in physics. So if I say Hitler invaded Russia because he wanted Lebensraum, he wanted living room in the East, that presupposes, that requires that the concept of Lebensraum must have been present in Hitler's mind. You cannot explain it in terms of intentional causation unless the cause functions in the actual consciousness or unconsciousness, in the actual mental life of the agent whose behavior is being explained. And that's not like anything in physics. The body that falls doesn't have to think, I got to get to the ground. According to the formula, or I'll be letting my side down. I won't be doing my job. Whereas in the case of intentional causation, the person who's trying to do something has to have a mental concept, a mental entity that functions causally in producing the behavior to be explained. Now, this is offensive to a certain class of people who have a certain scientific conception of the social sciences, and they have a conception based on physics. And they will point out that there are lots of explanations in the social sciences that don't employ concepts that are used by the agents in question. So in economics, if we say that in the theory of the firm, that the rational entrepreneur sells at this point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. I was brought up on that when I studied economics as an undergraduate. I don't know, maybe they made some progress and they don't tell you that anymore, but I bet it's still there. They loved it. I mean, why not? It's very beautiful. And you don't have to appeal to what's in the mind of the agent. I mean, in Oxford, they went and asked local entrepreneurs, do you sell where marginal cost equals marginal revenue? Most of these guys never heard of it. They said things like, well, when it comes to haberdashery items, we get a 40% markup. Why? Well, that's what Dad got. You know, they inherited the firm from their dad. Nowadays, they've all been to business school. And so, yeah, they've been corrupted. They probably do say something like that. But it's not essential that they say that. So what's going on here? In economics, you don't have to specify concepts that were in the minds of the agents. The agents don't have to be thinking about things like the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier effect due to increased interest rates. You don't have to do that because why? Because what you're describing here is the systematic fallout of intentional causation. In economic theory, it appears to people that you can neglect the common sense intentional causation and just talk about the systematic consequences or the systematic fallout. But if you forget that the whole thing rests on the assumption of collective intentionality, it rests on a complex set of intentional causation. If you think that the whole thing is really like physics, and what matters is the mathematical sophistication of the model, you get in the kind of mess we are currently in, where they really did think that the mathematically more sophisticated models were the ones that had greater scientific value, and they all rested on a set of assumptions that turned out to be false. And as I think I mentioned before, one of the scandals is nobody understands what happened. I try to figure out what happened. I mean, maybe Soros does. Now, Soros keeps writing about it. His name is George Soros, and he is the favorite economic thinker and billionaire of all philosophers because he's a failed philosophy graduate student. He was a philosophy graduate student in London, and he thought, well, you know, I'm not all that great as a philosopher, so I'll go into business. And Soros lost $400 million in one afternoon, and I know he must have lost much more than that because that's how much he admitted to losing, but he had made a whole lot more than that. So Soros is successful by the standards of economic activity, and he's writing a whole lot of stuff about the current economic crisis, usually in the New York Review, and I recommend that you read it. Unfortunately, I tend to get bored with it and haven't finished many of those articles, but I promise, well, I don't promise, but I predict that I'll go back and report back to you. All right. Anyway, so where are we? I have said it's false that it's always a relation between events, that there are experienceable cause and effect relations, because the primitive notion of causation, the notion of making something happen, it is out of the question that every causal relation should instantiate an actual law, that there should be a law that describes this case under some description or other. And there is a type of logical relation where there are causal, and in the case of intentional causation, because the specification of the cause will give an intentional content which is logically related to the effect, which is the condition of satisfaction. Now, I've only briefly hinted at what is the form of explanation that we're looking for in the social sciences, and of course it'll turn out that there are different forms. An explanation in cultural anthropology is not will not be the same type of explanation as you get in macro or microeconomics. So I'll say more about those later. But the basic thing that we want in explaining human phenomena is, why did it happen? What made it happen? And that's a specification of a cause or set of causes. And the form of causation that is operative in social relations is intentional causation, particularly collective intentionality. Now, what can you read on this? Well, there's a book by Nancy Cartwright called How the Laws of Physics Lie. And what she maintains is that there aren't enough laws, Cartwright, how the laws of physics lie, and she maintains that really there aren't enough laws of physics to go around. I mean, it's just absurd to suppose that everything is describable by the laws of physics. Now, I don't understand her book because I don't know the mathematics of physical laws well enough to follow the mathematical portions, but maybe some of you do. As far as I can tell, the book was unfortunately not very influential. I thought it was an important book, but apparently that was a minority opinion, because she challenges the current orthodoxy that says everything is describable by physical laws. I am suspicious of the role that scientific laws play in our intellectual culture, but I don't have an intelligent criticism. I told you, I asked Eric Kandel, how come there are no laws in your book about the brain? And he says, well, we're getting there. And I think your point was right, that the most you get would be a mapping onto the area where there really are laws, which will be physics and chemistry. But the laws of physics and chemistry will be, let me start the sentence again. The phenomena at the level of biology are multiply realizable in the laws of physics and chemistry, and that's why you don't get strict laws. You will get all kinds of messy cases that don't fall under strict law, but you can still understand how it works because you figure out how it works by looking at what causes what. Think of what it's like to explain to a child how a car engine works. Now, everything you say will instantiate some law of physics, but what you're talking about is just how this cause worked on that cause. The fuel-air mixture is ignited by the action of the spark plug, by the firing of the spark plug. The burning of the fuel-air mixture releases heat energy, which puts pressure on the piston. The piston, because of the connecting rod, pushes against the crankshaft. And that crankshaft pushes, well, how do we get off onto this? I won't tell you the whole damn story. I once gave a lecture in Amsterdam, and nobody knew how to translate a crankshaft and camshaft into Dutch, you see, because they weren't used to talking about crankshafts and camshaft. And they said, well, the two Dutch words are the knokken as and the koer as. And I knew immediately at the camshaft has to be the knock-on-os, because in the camshaft you have all that knocking and knocking. That's what the camshaft does, right? And it turns out I was right. It's the knock-on-os, because anybody knows the camshaft does all that knocking and knocking. That's what the Tappet brothers call themselves the Tappet brothers, because of all the tappet knocking. Okay, anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is a point that was made last time, and that is the fact that you don't get strict laws is irrelevant to whether or not, in this case, whether or not the system is completely explainable and completely deterministic. You don't need laws. What you need is a description of how the machinery works, and that, I think, is probably characteristic of biology. All right, now I'm going to stop for questions, because then we're going to go on and apply some of these lessons to other issues. So I've said a lot about causation. Now, most of what I said, not everything, is said in the chapter on intentional causation in intentionality, and I hope that's on the assigned reading, because I want you to read it. I think, what is it, chapter 5? Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is the background. Oh, God, I don't want to think about the background, but chapter 4 on intentional causation I feel pretty good about. Now, the one thing I left out of that, because I didn't understand it, and that is free will. And, of course, you do get the gap. There is the problem of the gap between the reasons for the action and the making of the decision, between the decision and the onset of the action, between the onset of the action and its continuation to completion. And those are not three distinct gaps. Those are the continuous gap of conscious rational behavior, where you have a sense of alternative courses of action open to you. All right, let's take questions about what I said so far. I'm going to get a drink of water. Yeah. Yes.
But the idea of experiencing causality in perception, you say you experience that the object causes your perception of it, but it seems to me like you would only experience your perception of it,
yeah,
not that the object causes the perception.
Okay. Yeah, now, no, this is a good point. Everybody at the back hear it. The point is that she'll grant me that if I raise this, I experience my mental processes causing it to go up. I experience the trying. But, for example, when I look at it, I don't experience the object causing my experience of it. I just see the object. I don't experience the causal relation. Okay, I want to say the senses differ in this regard. If somebody comes along and shoves me, then I do experience the object, the cause of my moving. I experience the fact that the guy shoved me causes me to move. However, vision, you don't get a shove in vision. Nonetheless, it seems to me, if you think about it, you will see that there is a causal component. And the way I like to think of that is this. Imagine that we had a perfect ability to form visual images which were indistinguishable from actually seeing the object. So I could look at this and then close my eyes and form a visual image which, as Hume would say, had the same force and liveliness as the actual impression of the object. Imagine you could do that at will. You get with me so far? Then I want to say it would be obvious that there's a distinction between seeing an object and imaging an object, because the seeing of the object is not controllable by your will. It's not up to you, whereas the imaging of the object is up to you. There's a different quality of the experience when you passively experience the object causing in you a perception of it, and when you, by your own intentionality, when your own intention and action cause a visual image. So this is a debate that I have with phenomenologists, and they say, well, you don't experience the causation in visual perception. And I say you do, but it's more subtle. It's not like the being pushed by something. I agree that it's not like that, because the object doesn't push your eyeball. Nonetheless, it is, you experience that it happens to you passively in a way that is caused by something else other than your own will. Yes? No, I don't. There's no inference involved. You just see the object. The question I am now asking is there a causal component in the perception of the object? And I want to say there is, but it's more subtle than the causal component in Elizabeth Anscombe being forced to jump by the loud noise that she heard, or in me being moved off of the sidewalk by somebody banging into me and pushing me. But all the same, the passivity of the experience makes it, on reflection, makes it clear to you that it is caused by something other than your intention and action. Whereas in the case, you could have an identical visual image, same degree of vividness or force and vivacity, as Hume would say, but it is not experienced as caused by an outside object. It's up to you. It's up to your will. And this, as I mentioned earlier, is why we do not have a problem of the freedom of perception. In a way, we do have a problem of the freedom of the will, because our will has effects that are up to us, but in this way the perception is not up to us. It's up to how the world is and the state of our perceptual apparatus. But anyway, that's a deep question, and it's a continuing debate between me and various phenomenologists. I saw a hand up at the back of the room. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, think about it some more. I mean, we're not going away. We're going to be here. Yeah, you and then you.
How do we translate a first-person experience of causation to, say, billiard balls where there's no first-person experience?
Okay. No, now this is a very, again, the question was, how do you translate the case of the billiard balls? How do you translate from a personal experience of causation to cases of the billiard balls? And to put it more dramatically, how is it possible that I understand causal relations between astronomical bodies if my model of causation comes from my own experiences? And the answer is this, that the relationship you experience when you're actually involved in activities in the world, the relationship you experience when you make something happen or something makes something happen to you, that relation is one you can observe when you observe other things happening in the world. So the case I like to imagine is the child learns that it can have a lot of fun smashing the crockery just by hitting it with a hammer. But then it discovers by observation that the same effect happens when the crockery falls to the floor, even though the child didn't knock it to the floor. The same effect that you can make happen yourself by smashing the crockery, you can observe when your brother smashes the crockery. You can see it's the same thing happening there. And the same thing happens when the crockery just falls to the floor without you having pushed it, and it smashes. That is, the causal relation, which is experienceable, is observable when it's not part of your experience, and it's observable as the same relation. Now, of course, it is a seeming cause. That is, what we're talking about is the character of your experiences. It's typical in Marx Brothers movies that the following kind of thing happens. Groucho will raise his arm, and the window will go up. So he quickly lowers his arm, the window quickly goes down. Then he slowly raises it, and the window slowly goes up, and so on. After a while, he gets the idea, this is my intention and action that's moving the window. And he will then experience himself opening and closing the window. Now, we know that this is an illusion, but all the same, it is a case which is like the real case, because the relationship that you observe when you make it happen, and here you seem to be making something happen, the relation you experience when you make something happen is one you can observe when somebody else makes it happen, and then you can generalize it where there's no experience involved at all, and that is where the objects are operated on by forces that have no intentionality, such as the force of gravity. So we understand the explanation of why the orbit of the planets is elliptical, because it's a combination of gravitational attraction plus Newton's first law determines that it will continue to move in an elliptical orbit, because on Newton's first law, a tendency is to keep going in a straight line, but it's pulled out of a straight line by the force of gravity. We understand that perfectly because we know what it is for forces to make something happen. You look worried, but I think that's the right explanation. Now, notice, I'm not giving you an explanation of the psychology of child development. For all I know, the idea of causation may be innate. But Michaud did a whole lot of experiments where he asked people, did you observe a cause in this case? Did you observe one thing causing something else? And they said, yes. They actually had the experience of seeing this cause that. That's part of their phenomenology. Now the question is, how can that be the case? And the answer is that the relationship that they experience when they make something happen is a relationship they can observe when they can see other things happening. And that's Michaud's account of the psychology. I don't much care about the psychology. It's interesting. I'm interested in the rationality of our eagerness or willingness to apply the notion of causation beyond the boundaries of our experience if we get the first notion of cause from our experience. And I want to say there's no problem there. It's no more difficult than imagining that the object continues to have its properties even when it's in the dark and you can't see it. The fact that you acquire the conception from your experiences does not mean that you cannot have a conception of these phenomena existing apart from your experiences, something that Berkeley never could get. Berkeley thought, no, it's got to be somebody's experience or it can't exist at all. Yes, you're on.
Sounds like what you're talking about isn't a relationship between two objects. That when you say cause here, you're talking about some psychological property in you when you are observing constant conjunction between sets of events. And I don't really see how you're getting beyond human.
Well, let's try it. Now, there are constant conjunctions that I observe. I observe regularly that a period of night in Berkeley is followed by a period of day in Berkeley. That is a constant conjunction. On a straight Humean definition, this is a standard objection to Hume, I would have to say, well, night causes day, because I observe a constant conjunction and I get a lively idea of one whenever I think about the other. But that's not a causal relation. They're both explained by something else. Okay. But now then, let's take another case where I really do experience a causal relation. I decided to raise my arm. I had an intention in action. An amazing thing happened. Lo and behold, the damned arm went up. And it was up to me. I caused it to go up. How exactly did I cause it to go up? Well, in ordinary speech, you could say either I raised it, or if you want to be more epistemically cautious, you could say I tried to raise it. But we know that those tryings have a name. That's called an intention in action. So part of the experience of that particular intention in action was experiencing it as causing its condition of satisfaction. It caused the arm to go up. Yeah.
You didn't explain causation as anything other than a psychological...
That's all we need. No, this is all we need now. Let me I say what I'm saying. Hume's point is that you cannot have an experience of necessary connection. You cannot have an experience of a causal relation. And I want to say you can. You experience it all the time. Now then, is there any ground for supposing that that experience is other than a hallucination? Well, think of cases where it is a hallucination. Case where it is a hallucination where I try to raise my arm, but unknown to me, the nerves have been cut. So my trying has no effect at all. But I happen to have my watch on, and there is a huge magnet in the ceiling, and they turn on the magnet, and it raises my arm. That would be a case where I had the hallucination. That's possible. Are we really to think, well, all cases are really like that? No. The experience of causation is like the experience of solidity or red or any other perceptual property. Any given instance might be an illusion, but all the same, there's a rational ground for my believing that tables are solid and that that guy has on a T-shirt that's red because we have all sorts of epistemically pretty well-based reasons for supposing that not all of our experiences are hallucinations, that the hypothesis that I'm really a brain in a vat is not to be taken seriously at this level. Yes? That's right.
How do you know?
Yeah.
And so
Well, but the point is, what I know when I know is that this relation holds. But what I do not have to do, it's not part of the rules of this game, that I have to answer skepticism. That is, that I have to answer the claim, well, maybe it's all a hallucination. Maybe you're really a brain in a vat, because that's perfectly general. That works for anything. What I'm here trying to show is that the belief in the existence of causation has the same rational ground as the belief in the existence of solid objects. You experience them all the time. Yes, but could you be hallucinating? Yeah, I could, but I'm not. Yes.
It's not just hallucination. It's
Yeah.
that we are not observing causation. We are observing constant conjunction and deciding causation, and we do that very badly.
No, but that's, you see, but let's think about the case. There is a case where I observe a constant conjunction. I observe, for example, that if I drink an awful lot of Cabernet Sauvignon, I get slightly dizzy, and I have the impression that I understand a lot of philosophical issues that it's clear that I don't, on the next day, that I don't understand. Now, that's a constant conjunction. Is the Cabernet Sauvignon makes me dizzy. And it's a causal relation, but what I experience is a constant conjunction. But it's not like that when I do this. What's the difference? This is actually a case of trying. And notice the notion of trying is a causal notion. It means trying, attempting to bring about. It means trying to cause. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. And the experience I'm having is the experience of me causing my arm to go up. Now, it could be the case that I could have that very experience and be mistaken. All the same, the experience had a character which is like the character of seeing something solid or seeing something red. Namely, there's no way I can describe the experience without saying that it's an experience that involves a certain type of intentional content. Just as this is solid or that's red, the intentional content here is causation. I experience myself making this happen. That's the name of the experience. And again, of course, it might be a mistake. I might be having hallucination, but it's important to see what the hallucination is a hallucination of. It's a hallucination of causation. So all we experience is seeming causes, but that's all we experience anyway. As we experience seeming houses and seeming tables and seeming chairs and so on. It's just that in general we get it right.
You moved away from, when you started talking about experience and causation, you moved away from astronomical bodies.
No, but the point is now, the question is, I don't start with astronomical bodies. Even bright children don't start with astronomical bodies. They start with moving the blocks around and maybe hammering the wooden pegs into the round holes and that kind of stuff. That's where the child masters the concept of causation. Then we have an interesting question. How is it possible, and not how does it in fact happen, that's a matter for child development, I don't know the answer to that, but how is it possible rationally that the relationship I experience when I make something happen is a relationship I can observe when I'm not making it happen? And I tried to answer that earlier. And that is, it's the same relation that I observe when I'm not doing it that I experience when I am doing it. But that's no more mysterious than the question of, well, how can it still be red when you're not looking at it? Or how can it still be square when you're not looking at it? And the answer is because the same relation that you observed when you looked at it, the same feature you observe when you look at it is a feature that can exist even when you're not looking at it. Okay, other questions? There was somebody at the back who had a... All right, well, let's go on. Now, how far have we got? We got in the structure of intentionality, including collective intentionality. The structure of causation, including especially intentional causation. Intentional causation is not something to be bashful about or ashamed of. It is the most primitive experience of causation. It's the experience of making something happen or having something make something happen to us. Now, how do we get from all of this apparatus that we've introduced to human civilization? Well, here we go. Step one, we have to recognize that by way of collective intentionality, human beings can impose functions on objects where the function is not intrinsic to the object in question. And you remember in one of the very first lectures, I said we needed to have a distinction between those features of nature which were observer independent or intentionality independent from those that were observer relative. Force, mass, and gravitational attraction are observer independent. They don't give a damn about us. Now, by the way, some physics textbooks are misleading. They'll say things like, well, we now know from relativity theory that mass is observer relative because of Einstein's relativity theory. That's a different sense of observer relativity. It means relative to a coordinate system. But I mean this relative to actual intentionality. And money, property, and government and marriage exist relative to human intentionality in a way that force, mass, and gravitational attraction don't. If all human beings disappeared, there would be no money, property, government, or marriage, but there would still be planets and tectonic plates and weak and strong nuclear forces. Okay, so you have a distinction between the observer independent and the observer relative, and now I want to make a strong claim. All functions are observer relative. This thing is a knife, but it has the function of a knife because we have imposed that function on it. If we stopped using these things as knives and used them strictly as paperweights, then it would cease to be knives, and there would be a whole lot of new paperweights. This is has the function of a knife because that's what we have created and used it for. All functions are observer relative. We're blinded to this fact by the fact that in biology we frequently discover functions. It wasn't until the 17th century that people discovered that the function of the heart was to pump blood. And you remember that Aristotle famously thought the function of the brain was to cool the blood. I don't really believe Aristotle thought that, but textbooks always say that. You want to be suspicious of these guys. But anyhow, as I told you earlier, I don't know any. I know roughly how to spell it, but I don't know anything else about Aristotle. Okay. So functions are observer relative, and we're blinded to this fact by the fact that we discover functions in biology. We discover that the function of the vestibular ocular reflex is to stabilize the retinal image. The function of the heart is to pump blood. All right, but notice when we make these discoveries, the discovery is made against the background of a presupposed teleology. We presuppose that life and survival are valuable, that they are positive values, and consequently something can serve a function relative to the achievement of this value. If we thought that death and extinction were the only things valuable, then hearts would be dysfunctional and cancer would be immensely functional. It's only because we think good vision is better than bad vision that we can say that the function of the retinal image, the function of the vestibular ocular reflex, is to stabilize the retinal image. It improves vision. So when we discover functions in biology, it is against a presupposed set of values, against a presupposed teleology. And where do these values come from? Well, it's observer relative. Now, a lot of people misunderstand this point because they think, well, that would make it the case that biology wasn't really a science because it's all observer relative, all these functions. But remember, that doesn't follow. That's a confusion between the ontological sense of the objective-subjective distinction and the epistemic sense. You can have an epistemically objective science about a domain which contains ontologically subjective phenomena. You can have an epistemically objective science of biology in a way that acknowledges the fact that some of the phenomena that you discover in biology, such as functions, are observer relative. Roughly speaking, a function is a cause that serves a purpose. All functions are causes. Some causes serve purposes, and we call those functions. Where do those purposes come from? They come from our set of values, and in that sense, all functions are observer relative. I'll take a question. Oh, did you have it? Oh, no, okay. Okay, so that's point number one. human beings have a capacity to impose functions on objects. And if you look around you, the world is full of things. This has a function, and this has another function. I won't demonstrate it. This has another function. There's all these damn functions everywhere you look. And they're all created by us. They're all observer relative. Now, that doesn't mean that it's subjective epistemically. It is an epistemically objective fact that this damn thing is a knife, and it performs all of these functions the Swiss knives are supposed to perform. All right, but now then we get to a crucial distinction, and as far as I know, only humans can do this. Lots of animals have functions. I mean, birds build nests, and beavers build dams. All sorts of functions, and these damn monkey experts study all sorts of things that the monkeys do. The monkeys, you will use a stick to dig up the ants' nest so that they can then eat all the ants, and so on. So there are all these objects that perform functions. But now human beings have a remarkable capacity, and this is going to be a crucial notion in the whole explanatory apparatus that I'm introducing in this course, and that is human beings have a capacity to impose functions on objects where the function is performed not in virtue of the physical structure of the object, or not solely in virtue of the physical structure. See, this performs its function solely in virtue of its physical structure. If you try to make this out of butter or papier-mâché, it wouldn't work. It performs the functions that it does in virtue of its physical structure. But there are lots of things that are very important in our lives that perform the function not in virtue of their structure, but in virtue of the fact that by collective intentionality, we have assigned a certain status to those things. And in virtue of the collective recognition of the status, the object or person can perform functions which can only be performed as long as there is collective recognition of that status. And my favorite example is money. It isn't... See, these things perform a function just as the Swiss knife performs a function, but it performs the function not in virtue of its physical structure. The physical structure is rather trivial. It's a piece of paper with ink stains on it, but we take it seriously. And the reason we take it seriously is because it's been assigned a status. It's money, and it performs the function of money insofar as there is a collective acceptance or recognition. See, here's another one of these things that won't perform that function in the United States. It performs the function in Europe. It's a 10-euro note, and it performs a function in virtue of the collective acceptance of it as having a certain status in Europe. In the United States, it's no good to you. In stores, you got to exchange it for some of the local stuff. Okay, now let's look very closely at this. Money performs a function, and that's an objective fact. It performs a function, but only in virtue of the fact that there is an ontologically subjective component in the existence of money. Namely, to put it very crudely, people have to think it's money. What fact about it makes it money? Nothing physical is sufficient for it to be money. What makes it money, to put it very crudely initially, is we all think it's money. Now, there's a story behind why we think it. It's issued by the Treasury. It's issued by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing under the authority of the Treasury, and the Treasury itself acts under the authority of the United States government. So there's a whole apparatus, but all of that apparatus consists of more status functions. Now, I'm going to call all of these where you have money and professors and governments and presidents of the United States. I'm going to call all of those status functions. Now, I gave the example of money because that's an inanimate object, but you yourself are locked in a whole system of status functions. To take a famous case, it isn't that Barack Obama is president in virtue of some physical or genetic structure that he has, but rather it's in virtue of the fact that a certain status has been assigned to him, the status of President of the United States. There's an elaborate procedure by which we assign that status, but he's got it. He's got it for several more, well, a couple more years, and then he has to come up for a re-election to see if he can get that status reassigned. But he's got a status function, and the definition of a status function is it's a function that can only be performed in virtue of the collective recognition by the community at large that the entity or person in question has a certain status, and with that status goes the function. You can perform the function only as long as you have a continued recognition of the status. All right, and now I'm going to make a strong claim, namely, that's the chief distinction between human societies, between human civilization and all other forms of animal life known to me. Now, again, who knows? Maybe there's some tribe of chimpanzees that also has money, property, government, marriage, income tax, summer vacations, and sabbatical leaves. I'm not knocking the primates. You know, if they got all our problems, welcome to the club. But I want to mark something that's special about us, which I know for a fact that we have, and that is we have status functions. All right, so our next question, and this is the crucial question in the ontology of human society, is how are those created and how are they maintained in existence? Now, you might say, well, look, what's special about Barack Obama? A group of primates will have an alpha male and an alpha female. And I went to visit Tomasello with all of his primates in Leipzig, and it's true. They have a fairly well-defined hierarchy. What's the difference between the alpha male in the White House and the alpha male in the zoo in Leipzig? Well, there's a huge difference, because the alpha male in the zoo, roughly speaking, has to be able to fight every day for his position as alpha male. There's no collective recognition that he can count on. It's strictly a brute physical fact on a daily basis that he can beat up the other potential alpha males. By the way, he gets help. There is some collective intentionality. He's got friends who help him beat off the other guys. But it is strictly a matter of brute force. Now, here's the remarkable thing about status functions. Barack Obama does not have to get up in the morning and think, well, maybe today somebody's going to beat me out as the alpha male. You know, there may be arm wrestling contests that I will lose, or maybe a bunch of guys will just jump me and my friends won't be able to beat up on those other guys. He can count on the continuing status. Similarly with these bits of paper, it becomes, though it's ontologically subjective that it's money, it is epistemically objective. It's an objective fact. When I go into a store, I can count on them. They don't say, well, maybe you think it's money, but why do we care what you think? Because they know we all think it's money. It's collective intentionality. Now, when people stop thinking it's money, you're in deep trouble. And that's what happens in situations of hyperinflation. There was a wonderful period when the Soviet Union was collapsing, when the ruble was becoming more or less worthless. And the way you got a cab in Moscow was by holding up dollars. That would get you a cab. Or this was really a decline of currency into barter. If you held up a pack of Marlboro cigarettes, that would get you a cab. Marlboros were functioning as a kind of barter. And why Marlboros, I don't know. But rich people would throw a few packs of Marlboros on the back seat of their car to show how rich they were. I mean, so you could, you couldn't get a cab just by getting a cab. What you could do was, if you held up 4 fingers, that means I'll pay 4 times as much as is shown on the meter. That's inflation. Or you can hold up dollars and say, I'll pay you in dollars. That would work. Or you can hold up a pack of Marlboros. So this is a case where the currency was in deep trouble. Okay, but the important thing to see now is currency is a kind, like presidents and universities and summer vacations and cocktail parties, are kind of, in a sense, a massive exercise of imagination. You can't discover that money exists. You have to create it. All right, how do you do it? What's the form of the creation? Well, when I wrote my first book on this subject, I thought there's a very simple principle by which you do it, and it's what it's called the Constitutive Rule. You remember, I make a distinction between the constitutive rules that constitute the very behavior that they regulate versus the regulative rule that regulates an antecedently existing form of behavior. Drive on the right-hand side of the road is a regulative rule. Such and such a position in chess constitutes the white being in check. That's a constitutive rule. The knight can make such and such a moves. That is a constitutive rule because that says such and such counts as a correct knight move. And the regulative rule takes the form of do act A. The regulative rule just is the form of a directive, do A, drive on the right-hand side of the road, whereas the constitutive rule takes a special form, X counts as Y, or X counts as Y in context C. So crossing the goal line while in possession of a ball, if a play is in progress, counts as scoring a touchdown in American football. Such and such a move counts as a legal knight move in chess. Winning a majority of the electoral votes in the Electoral College counts as becoming president-elect. You're not yet president. You got to get sworn in and all that. And those are constitutive rules. And it looked to me like human civilization is created by repeated applications of that form. Now, you might say, well, that's too pathetic. I mean, you can't create human civilization with that. But the answer is it has two formal properties that are quite remarkable and give it an enormous power. One is it iterates upward indefinitely. So right now, for example, I am making noises through my mouth. Those noises count as uttering sentences of English. Uttering these sentences of English in this context counts as giving a lecture in philosophy of society. In some other context, uttering such and such noises will count as making a promise. Making certain sorts of promises counts as undertaking a contract. Undertaking certain sorts of contracts counts as getting married. Notice what's happening in all these cases is you have an upward movement where you go from X1 counts as Y1, where Y1 equals X2, and that counts as Y2, and then Y2 equals X3, and so on up. So making the noises counts as uttering sentences of English. Uttering those sentences counts as making a promise. Making that kind of promise in that context counts as getting married. And believe me, in the state of California, once you get married, institutionally speaking, all hell breaks loose. You're entitled to spousal benefits. You get income tax deductions. Under the current university laws, you even get a pregnancy leave. Even if you're a male, you get all sorts of, I know guys who've had difficult pregnancies, and they took all sorts of rights from the university on the ground of that. So this is a very powerful mechanism because it iterates upward indefinitely. Furthermore, it spreads out laterally. I don't just have money, but watch this locution now. I have money in my bank account in the Bank of America on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, California. It's put there by my employers, the university, regents of the University of California, and I use it to pay my state and federal income taxes along with my credit card bills and my utility bills. Now notice, every noun I uttered there, with the exception of Telegraph Avenue, identifies one of these institutional facts, where you have a status function which is created by the application of these rules. So the X counts as Y form is very powerful because it iterates upward indefinitely and it spreads out laterally. And it seemed to me when I wrote the construction that it's kind of the glue that holds human society together. Now I think I can improve on it by showing you how what underlies the Constitutive Rule is an even simpler and cruder mechanism, and I'll tell you about that on Tuesday.